We're away. Are we right? Okay, thank you and welcome to this information session for the Manila Travelling Studio for this year. We have an hour and we will, and first of all, I'll introduce myself, Kim Dovey, for those of you who don't know me. I'm Professor of Architecture and Urban Design. We have Crystal Legacy, who's an Associate Professor of Urban Planning, and Redden Recchio, who's a Senior Fellow in Urban Planning, and we will be co-leading the studio. This is the first studio of its kind now for a number of years, which is great to be able to do this again, because we've had a long-standing policy of trying to be able to connect with other cities and places that we can learn stuff that we can't learn easily in Melbourne. So I'm going to go through what the studio is going to be about, and we'll have plenty of time for questions, but I'd better get on with that. Otherwise, we won't get anywhere. I think there's a couple of people online. Well, one. Okay. Hi, Finn. First of all, tell you what this is about. It's the timing is a little bit difficult because we haven't had much choice about how to be able to run this. We had to do it outside of normal studio time, normal semester time. And there are other constraints like our partners in Manila and the weather in Manila and all kinds of other things. So I'm going to tell you about how it's going to go, and then we'll have some time for discussion. This is actually a research project, began as a research project, which we called OSIRIS, which is on-site improvement and redevelopment of informal settlements at the University of the Philippines. University of the Philippines, you can see from these slides, that's the view from the Chancellor's office. It looks like one of the most formal university campuses you'd ever see anywhere, but it happens to have 92 hectares of informal settlement actually on the campus. So this was an introduction to who we are. We're part of INFUR, which is the Informal Urbanism Research Hub, which is a kind of a research collective within this faculty that Crystal and I co-direct, which looks at informal urbanism of a range of different kinds in both global north and global south cities. In my case, mostly looking at informal settlement, in Redden's case, mostly looking at informal trading, and Crystal's case, mostly looking at citizen-driven planning. So I hope you can see some of the synergies that there are there between what we're looking at here. A few words, first of all, about what informal settlement is. This is like a whole lecture series condensed down to a few stock phrases. Informal settlement is not some kind of euphemism for slum, even though some of these settlements are seriously substandard. The informal settlement is really about self-organized design and planning. This is how cities are designed and planned when the state is not involved, usually out of the control of the state. Informal settlement is what enables affordable housing in most global south cities, and it enables the urban poor to establish a livelihood for themselves. So there's a lot at stake in understanding how informal settlement works. Informal settlement is largely incremental design and planning. It happens in very, very small increments, often a room at a time, or very, very small. So you often don't see it happening, and yet it's constantly changing. These settlements are under a kind of continuous change. And even though they may be substandard in many ways, they tend to become more durable over time. So many of the settlements that you see, and indeed many of the parts of cities that you travel halfway across the globe to visit as tourists, were originally informal settlements that have been upgraded effectively over time. And trying to do that with what's happening on the University of the Philippines campus is a part of what this project is all about. This is just a few street view images of the ways in which this campus has changed over the last, really over the pandemic. There's new buildings being built all the time. Informal settlement isn't just shacks. It's anything up to 4 or 5 story apartment buildings. And informal settlement incorporates industry and shopping and transport and recreation and open space and agriculture in some cases. It involves connections with cheap labor and transport and services for the larger city. Many of these cities would simply collapse if the informal parts of those cities were removed. And the removal of informal settlements is high on the agenda of many of the state planning agencies in these cities. So there's a struggle that goes on, and that the removal of informal settlements is fiercely resisted by many of the residents, okay, unless there is an alternative that works in terms of their livelihoods. If you want to know more about this, plug this word that you haven't heard before, Inventraset. If you plug that into Google, you'll find a performance by Redden and myself that will explain that over about 40 minutes rather than 1 minute. And one of the things you learn fairly fast about informal settlements is that they can't be displaced without damaging livelihoods. If you simply demolish them on the basis that there's something wrong with them or they're illegal, then you find that, first of all, they pop up somewhere else. So you haven't removed the problem, you have moved it around, and you have damaged the livelihoods of the people who are living there. And you've damaged the functionality of the city as well. We're going to be engaged on a community-based on-site upgrading program. Okay, so we're going to be working with community groups on the campus of the University of the Philippines. We're going to be working with the staff and students from the architecture and urban planning faculties on the University of the Philippines campus. And we're going to be working with those community groups. You see some red in there with some of the people that we were with last year. And this is a map where the darker pink shows the most informal of settlements. Informal settlement isn't one thing, all right? There's many, many different kinds of informal settlement. The more informal ones there are in the darker pink, and the lighter pink are semi-formal, if you like. You would not immediately look at them and say there was anything wrong with them. There's many of them on campus, and of course, they're not limited to the campus, they're all over Manila, all right? And we're going to be focusing in detail at some particular settlements. The first of these is called Arboretum. It's a settlement that has a fairly well-organized community base and is seriously, their existence in that place is seriously threatened because the university is intent on building a hospital on the site that they inhabit. The site they inhabit is largely forested. It's actually really quite beautiful in many ways. They often have shops out there on the main street, and they have a fairly makeshift settlement in the forest, and that will probably be demolished to make way for the hospital. And a part of our task will be to come up with some visions and some scenarios and strategies for what's possible to maintain the livelihoods of those people on the campus. And we're going to be looking at another settlement called San Vicente, which is not so far away. It's a different kind of settlement. It's been there much longer and is also threatened in different ways. A few more slides of that one. And we're also going to be looking at a smaller settlement called Aguinaldo. This is just a few snatches off the street view. We haven't had a chance yet to visit or study this settlement. But what we could learn from street view is that there's a sign out the front that translates as, "This land belongs to UP Diliman." Now, thus far, this seems to be the plan of the University of the Philippines, is to put up signs telling the residents that it's not their land, but not much else is going on. And you can also see in the lower slide a couple of uniformed guys. These guys, they're campus guards, who are the closest thing that you have to a planning agency on the campus. They negotiate what will be possible with the residents. I want to ask Redden if he wants to say a little bit about the way in which we're going to be working with these community groups.
Just additional details on partnership with community organizations. There is currently ongoing process, we call it people's planning process. So do
you want to come over near the microphone? Because if there's others who come later and we're going to record this. If there's friends of yours who couldn't get here today,
right,
we can send them a link.
Okay, so one of our goals within INPER is to make teaching and research more impactful. And in this studio, we're planning to really engage with community organizations and help them come up with a better, in a way, planning arrangement or design vision. Because when I was having a series of meetings with some community leaders, they were asking me if there could be some form of technical assistance from us, from professionals. And similar to what we did in 2020, student outputs could be very useful. It could be very supportive of the way they try to come up with their own grassroots initiatives or community agenda. So there is an ongoing process, and we will make sure that some of the activities that we will do in Manila will support those initiatives, and the outputs that will be produced by students, would also be supportive of their grassroots agenda. So it's community driven, but there is also some kind of collaboration with state agencies. There is this agency called Presidential Commission for the Urban Poor, whose primary mandate is to make sure that the fundamental rights of the urban poor are protected. So, and of course, there would be a lot of tensions, and that's part of the learning process here. Yeah.
Okay. Crystal, did you want to say anything?
Oh, well, I guess, I mean, have you come to the end of your presentation?
How about what?
Have you come to the end of your
No,
presentation?
no.
Okay, no.
We've got to wait a
I'll
bit.
say some things at the end.
Okay. All right. Sorry, we need to cover a little bit more ground here. There'll be a range of kind of parameters that will depend to some degree on your disciplinary background. But we hope this is a multidisciplinary studio, so we're hoping that you all, those who come, would be open to learning across those disciplinary boundaries and working with people from other disciplines as well. We're going to be looking at things like the density of settlements, the densities of buildings and of populations. We'll be looking at construction durability, and so some of these settlements are going to be unsustainable, need to be demolished and replaced. Other parts have existing value, and you might be wanting to retain them and so on, and making those decisions, learning about community organization and how that impacts on all this, learning about functional mix, the way in which shopping and production integrates with housing in different ways, very different ways than they do in the formal city. There's no zoning here, of course, and learning about how street lane networks function, about the importance of street and lane width and car access, and the production of open space and so on, and the importance of the open space. So those are some of the parameters. Then there's the schedule that we have got in place, which is that there will be a series of pre-trip sessions. The subject is a 25-point subject, and it's mostly packaged into the mid-year break. There will be some sessions on Saturdays leading up to the end of semester. Okay, and this is the pre-trip work on 3 Saturdays, including one presentation from you, which will count for 10% of the final assessment. And those will be on May 20, May 27, and June 3. So anyone who applies needs to be able to participate from those dates. The trip we've scheduled into June 4 to 14. So that's the period when we will be in Manila. We arrive on the 4th, leave on the 14th. And that will be a matter of field work and of studio work and of presentations, and the detailed schedule of that will be worked out further down the track. But everyone needs to be able to commit to those dates. You can't get there a couple of days late or leave a couple of days early. So that's kind of the minimum time in Manila. There will be a post-trip intensive after a bit of a gap. So about a month after that is free. If you needed to do some travel or want to do some travel, we'd encourage you to go back to your home countries or whatever, have a bit of a break in the middle of the year, and then come back for a post-trip intensive, primarily conducted in the last week before the second semester starts. But then the development of design visions and frameworks and plans and strategies would continue into the second semester, leading up to an exhibition maybe a month into second semester. but this should not interfere too much with your second semester work. That's the schedule. And sorry, and some percentages are linked to those into the handbook. A new subject has been created for this, which would be online, I think, by tomorrow morning. Wasn't quite given a guarantee that it's up yet, but it will be. And so that the final part of this would be entail 50% of your assessment. The actual field trip itself is about 40%, okay? And a few slides from previous studios. This is not the first time we've done this. I've run about 5 of these. We did one in Manila. This was one of the things that we do is we set up a studio space in the hotel that we're staying. For reasons of security, we all stay in the same hotel. We need to all stay in the same hotel, and it needs to be a secure hotel. These are hot, humid climates that many of us are not as used to as others. And it's useful to be able to go back to an air-conditioned room and an air-conditioned studio and get a lot of the work and the meetings and so on might take place in those rooms. This is the one we did in Manila 3 years ago. That was our studio. It's basically a rich person's hotel suite that we had the furniture cleared out of, right? It's just a big room. But we had some, I mean, they weren't all women, I have to say, even though it might look like it. And we didn't have a party the whole time, but we put on a play and there were some props. Okay. Merrick, who's helping us out here today, is an alumnus from the previous trip to Manila. And if you have any questions about how it runs and what it's like, then yeah, ask Merrick. He can give you untrammeled advice. Oh, and that was one of our means of transport in the back of one of the jeepneys, which are the local minibus transport around Manila. And this is some of the work that came out of that studio. I'm not saying that yours should look like this. I'm just saying that we were doing analytic work on trying to understand how these cities work and how these neighborhoods work. So we're teaching a lot of this stuff, and if it is not in your disciplinary background, we hope you would be open to learning this, but we're trying to bring together issues of across architecture, landscape, urban design and urban planning, and have students live and work with each other and so on. So, and this is just some more of that student work. It ranged across from urban design and planning to architecture and landscape. So that, and some of the stuff has been fed back to those different community groups too, to see whether we can change the modes of thinking about what the future of informal settlements is, because we have to move on from the idea that they'll simply be demolished and replaced. It's not sustainable, and it's certainly not happening. What's happening is a kind of standoff. The university puts up a sign, says you don't own the land, and they're not going anywhere. The eligibility, anyone who's enrolled in the MSD is eligible. It's a 25-point elective, so you have to have 25 points of elective to spend, or you can substitute it for another class with a coordinator's approval. Now, this may or may not be possible. Sid tells me it will be possible in landscape. I'm told that the CDE studios in architecture will not be possible, but the design thesis in architecture may be possible. In urban design, it may be possible. That is going to depend on the coordinator's answer to that question. There will be a faculty subsidy. The faculty subsidy is not, it's not great in my view, but it is what it is. The faculty subsidy will cover all of the hotel accommodation, including breakfasts, in a pretty decent hotel with pretty good access to the campus, fairly short, 5 or 10 minutes, and some of the food and events and travel connections and so on will also be covered by that, sort of getting to the site and taxis in the morning and stuff like that. But the subsidy will not include the airfare. The airfares will need to be organised by you, so you'll need to be able to commit to buying an airfare when you apply for the studio. The current prices, Melbourne, Manila return, depend on how willing you are to handle a layover in some other city. If you want to fly direct, you can fly, well, Qantas goes direct from Sydney and Philippine Airlines flies direct from Melbourne. That costs about $1,100 return. And if you're willing for a bit of a layover of 3 hours, you can get it down to $950. And if you take 10 hours, you can get another $200 off, according to Redden's research. Now, that was Merrick's research yesterday. Okay, so those prices may, of course, go up by the time we're able to run this process and get the approvals done. And we can blame Merrick at that point. The food and transport costs, you would have to budget for maybe a half to 2/3 of what you spend when you're in Melbourne. I mean, things are cheaper in Manila than they are here. So it's hard to say what that would be. I don't know what your food tastes are, or how upmarket you like to eat, or how many foodies we have. But the food is good, and it's a pretty open market in food over there.
And the hotel is very close to a shopping mall complex.
Oh, it's in a shopping mall complex. You don't need to go outside. If if it weren't for the project we've got, you could live the entire time in the shopping mall. In terms of visas, Australian citizens will need to purchase a visa on arrival.
I actually just checked yesterday, and Australian citizens don't need the visa if you're staying there for less than 30 days. You just need to follow some, I think there are some travel guidelines.
Okay, so
really those related to COVID.
So
you can send the link to.
We will change that.
Change
that. Okay. Now, we're not quite sure about other Southeast Asian citizens also don't need a visa, but other people with other citizenship will have to check with the Philippine embassy site, and you may need to apply for a visa.
You can apply for electronic visa, and the normal period it takes to get one, I think, is 1 week for the regular one. If you want faster service, all that would cost you around $100 US, so that's about 150 Australian dollars. If you want a faster processing time, I think it would cost you around 250 Australian dollars. So
the world is not fair. You've heard that before, right? Where you happen to be born sort of makes a difference. The applications, now this is a strict deadline because we need to turn this around in something of a hurry. We didn't set this whole process. We'd hoped to be doing this last year, but the bureaucratic process has moved very slowly. Midnight on Sunday, March 26th. Okay, so it's not far down the track. You don't have long to make this decision. You will need to submit directly to the email that's at the bottom of this sheet, which is to Aftab Hussain, who is the academic programs and teaching support officer within this faculty. You can email him with questions about the, if you like, the administrative parts, the non-academic parts of this, if you need to. You need to inform him of the student name, your name and student number, and then he will put together, and you need to submit a maximum 300-word statement of interest. We will not be happy if you submit more than 300 words. It's not that we don't want you to do much work, it's because we want you to be concise, and we're interested in what your motivations are for doing this subject. We're interested in what you are curious about, right? So a lot of question marks would be a good thing in a statement of interest. What are you curious about? What do you think you don't know? And what are your experiences of group work? We're interested in people who are going to be able to engage in effective collaboration. We need to work together. We need to be a team, and we need to be able to form you into small teams that will work effectively, reliably, responsibly in sometimes difficult situations with language differences and some sometimes serious protocols that we need you to comply with and to understand that stuff. So we need you to be all to be able to work together. We don't need individuals heading off at tangents. All applications will be emailed to Aftab Hussain. We're not asking for a huge amount of work here, so that just by submitting an application, you are committing to coming on the tour if you're selected, and that's all. You'll be informed. There'll be a very quick turnaround. You'll be informed by March 30. And apart from that date is that you do then, at a pinch, have a chance to disenroll from a first-year subject and to substitute this one if you're so choosing to do that. We're not suggesting you do that. We're simply saying we want to make that possible. If you have further questions for us, then they should come to me or to Redden. Our emails are there, or you can find them pretty easily. We'll respond as best we can. We'll try to stay on the same page in terms of the advice that we're giving you. And the rest of the session goes over to Crystal if she wants to say something.
I do want to say something before we go on, I guess, questions. Well, I went on this traveling studio with Kim and Redden and Merrick back in February 2020 before the World Cup. It was very interesting talking to be traveling with some sort. And one of the takeaway things that I gained was it was the best teaching experience like ever. Like it was awesome. That's why I'm here again to do it. And those who have spent time with me in the classroom know how much I love teaching. And this was the next step. So I don't know what it was like as a student. Merrick, maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah.
But it is a very rewarding experience. So if it is something that you can build into your course plan, and I would really encourage you to consider it because this is worthwhile. Merrick.
It's really hard to summarize in 15-30 seconds what a wonderful experience it was for me. I'd never studied overseas before, so I'm an Australian citizen, grew up 2 hours away, and then in 2020 I went to Manila to join this fantastic team. And I came back and I'm still reflecting on that fantastic time. I feel like I'm still learning from that time. So these lessons have stayed with me and are continuing to build as it goes on. Yeah, that's all I've got to say. It was great meeting the other people. There were lots of other architecture students, landscape architecture students, urban planning students, urban design students, maybe not. Regardless, there were I met a lot of people there, and we're some of us are really good friends now as well. So there's that personal social side to it too. Yeah, but happy to answer any questions you have about the student experience.
We were very lucky last time, as Crystal was saying. We went in February of 2020, and if you can remember what was happening in February 2020, this virus was taking off, and most of us were in denial. And we went with a big pile of masks. My suitcase was half full of masks to distribute. But it turned out that the Philippine authorities were much more alert to this than we were in Melbourne. We were all very safe, and we got back home safe, and then the world closed down. And we ended up on Zoom, but we knew each other pretty well by that stage. So your questions.
Just to clarify, so this is urban, that's the break, but you said we have to unenroll from subjects.
You don't necessarily have to unenroll. It seems that I can't get a clear answer as to whether this is a first semester or a second semester subject. We'd thought that would be a second semester subject because that seems easier, but it turns out that if we do it according to this timetable, it may be possible for you to unenroll from a first semester subject in order to take it if you choose to. Okay, we don't know how many applicants we will get. We're not presuming that each of you will submit an application. There's not a lot of people here at this session, but I'm guessing that we are going to get the numbers to make the studio run. If we go under about 12, then it will be cancelled.
in your case, you're taking all core subjects right now, so you probably wouldn't want to unenroll in the core subjects, but if you were taking an elective subject, and this might be true for some of you, you could unenroll in that.
Yeah. Yep.
Just to clarify on the role of us as a student when we are visiting there, just want to clarify if we act as a action researcher or as a facilitator when working with the community. I think there's a lot to cover. Right? Just want to clarify what are the roles, the main roles of us as a student when we're working with the community.
So we will be acting as the facilitators, and we will have community leaders with us during the community visit. So you will be acting like engaged scholars.
If I can guess at where that question's coming from, we think that there's like a real need for not for, if you like, for students or professionals to come in and tell these students what these communities what would be good for them, because most of our education is about formal design, formal plans, formal urban designs, formal architecture, where presumes that somehow we have the knowledge because we've been to one of the best universities and we know, and they don't. That doesn't work in this circumstance. We need to go there, we need to listen, need to work with them, but we do need to come up with ideas and visions that will enlarge the conversation about what's possible. And the design skill, the spatial imagination, that there's not enough open space here. Here's one option for where the open space could go. Here's an option where we could have 5 different distributed open spaces. Here's a different option. This area should be replaced. This area over here has some real value and should be preserved, right? That kind of spatial imagination is really necessary for the future of these settlements, but also for the university to find a way of dealing with this problem. Because the kind of design imagination that an architect or a landscape architect or an urban designer or an urban planner brings is necessary. And so that's why it fits so well into a faculty like this. So it's not as if you're just going to go there and be engaged in some community process. That you're going to be asked to come up with proposals for what should happen. All right?
Yeah. I mentioned a while back that there is an ongoing people's planning process, right? But at the same time, there is an existing top-down plan for, Kim mentioned Arboretum as a site for a big hospital run by the university. So there is an existing plan, and we don't have access to the data yet, but we will hopefully by the time we get there. But it's top-down, there's no consultation done with the community. What the grassroots organizations are doing now is to produce, in a way, a counter proposal that is informed by their own needs and aspirations. And of course, you can study later on both proposals and come up with your own design or planning visions that can inform some of the decisions to be made by both community organizations and by the university.
We want to encourage a different way of thinking, because that's what's needed to engage with these issues of urban informality. And we hope that after this, you would have developed a way of thinking that you can take to any highly informalized urban environment and apply it, even though it would be very different. I'll give you one example. The lower image here is a shop that has been designed by the woman and her husband who live just behind this wall. They live in an informal settlement on the campus behind the wall here, and they have a shop that they run, an informal trading stall out on the main street. And then they also have another one, the yellow awning at the top is the cover of an upstairs part of the shop. It's a restaurant. And when the police come along to remove the shop on the street, they just dismantle it and withdraw to the top shop looking over the wall. And then when the police are gone again, they can move down again. So that there's something about the way informal settlement and informal trading operates that is highly adaptive and agile, and indeed in many cases really quite beautiful and functional. Okay, and this is how people make livelihoods for themselves. You wipe out this shop, you've wiped out her livelihood. We want to encourage a way of thinking that can gear into that and can enable those things to happen that are never going to emerge from some top-down plan, or indeed from you know, she doesn't need an architect. She needs a better way of thinking about how architecture works. Any other questions?
So for the final, during the first intensive data, we have to release, I think a poster and a report, or what kind of final business for this subject. And another question is that I'm just curious if the university has implemented any proposal of the students 2020 that they proposed to the area.
So I don't quite understand the last part of the question, but I'll answer the first part and Redden will answer the last part. The first part, the last part of the final contribution, we want to have an exhibition, and we would like to be able to put the work that you've done together, put it in the atrium here, if we can find a slot that time in the atrium here, in order that other students in this faculty can learn about these issues. But also back in Manila, okay, and so we need to sort out. We can't be exact about what it is that we'll require. It may be a panel, but it will probably be a digital thing as well, okay. In which case we can also put this work on our website, and hope that these ideas actually have some impact, because that's really this is looking at a real world problem, okay. It's research led, but it's dealing with a real world problem. Now, whether the University of the Philippines will pick up on any of our ideas, I'm not entirely sure, but Redden.
In 2020, our site was not the UP campus. It's a settlement called Sitio San Roque, which is closer to our hotel, actually. And so we're dealing with some community groups. Some of the student outputs were used in designing their community gardens at the height of the pandemic. So I remember some of because community groups there were working with volunteer architects, planners, young students, probably some of them are as old as you are. And when the pandemic hit, some community leaders decided to develop some areas within the community into urban gardens. And they asked for some maps developed by the students. And one of the maps by, I think Kim showed it, by Jackie Mo, it's called the diagnostic map, was used to identify which areas within the community would be suitable for community gardens. So, and some outputs, particularly the planning arrangements, were also used to inform their own policy analysis in order to engage better with the local governments.
Some of the early work is often a kind of mapping, partly to get us more familiar with what's actually there, but partly because not only do these places not have an urban plan, which is functional, there are no plans of the actual community or the settlement itself. I mean, one of the things that happens with informal settlement is that they get left so-called off the map. That if you look at the street map of many of these cities that are highly informalized, you find there's a series of blobs where the streets are not actually mapped, partly because they're not formal streets, and the city may not even know where the streets go. And actually having some kind of map and an enumeration of how many families, households, and people live there is one of the first steps. So we've had a part of this research has been to document the numbers of people living there, and because it's not entirely clear, but around about 50,000 people live on the campus. It's a very large campus. The campus is about I don't know, 8 times the size of this one. This is why there's so much empty space on it. I mean, it's the National University of the Philippines. More questions?
So you will have a campus tour before you will have the community visits. Some UP students will definitely be with you. And you have that campus tour and probably city tour.
We'll seek to see other parts of Manila as well. We're essentially about 7 kilometers from the old center of Manila.
Colonial Center.
And the colonial center of Manila is really interesting, and there's lots and lots of rich and interesting, if sometimes difficult, parts of Manila. There's also highly formalized parts of Manila. There's parts that are essentially kind of private cities where all forms of informality are eradicated. You'd think you were in Canberra sometimes.
Yeah.
You mentioned about this, informal, like at the beginning of the lecture, the little gradual, like,
The word you haven't heard before. Is that,
Inventor set,
no.
No.
infer.
Oh yes, infer. Yeah. It's a research hub. It's kind of us. Yeah, you're looking at it, but it's much larger than that. It's a collective of researchers in the faculty, including PhD students, including Merrick, who's now a PhD student, and academics who are engaged in research on urban informality, right? So that urban informality is one of those multidisciplinary challenges for built environment thinking, you know, because it's the major form of urban development. I mean, we collectively are taught that architecture, urban design, urban planning, landscape architecture are all about having a plan first and putting it down, right? And then kind of filling it out. And that buildings, so that the norm is that every work of architecture has a plot, a site which has been planned, and that you build the building within the plot. That's not how informal settlement happens. And very often in informal settlement, the building comes first. People build a house because they need a house. And then the street network emerges from the gaps that are left over after people have built, and they change over time. And so it's a very, very different process. And in some ways it's the inverse, but it certainly requires a different way of thinking.
So the question is like, how long is this topic
The topic has been around for a long time, really goes about 50 years. Goes back to when economists, first of all, were saying, hey, there's a whole bit of the national economy that is not measured in the GDP, right? And then they realized that if you look at how much of certain products are being sold, then you're not counting all the products that are being sold on the street. You're not counting the street trading. If you're looking at all the housing that's being produced, then you're not counting the informal settlement. And the economists realized that the informal side of this was crucial to how cities work. But that didn't say much about the detail about how cities work, right? And so you get informal urbanism studies, mostly studying three main things: informal transport, you know, the kind of tricycles and tuk-tuks and whatnot, the rickshaws, the motorcycles that are often semi-formal. You're going to see a lot of that. You'll probably ride in them. The informal trading, the people simply setting up shops on the sidewalk. This is how informal urbanism works, and linked with informal settlement. And that word I mentioned, inventroset, is our way of, it's what's called a portmanteau word, where you collapse three different pre-existing things, in that case, street vending, transport, and settlement, into one word, inventroset. which has other meanings as well, but I won't go there. So urban informality is one of the big challenges of research in our field, but also of practice in our field, because when you go out to practice, particularly in a global South city, you are going to find that many of those locations are kind of highly informalized, that the ways of doing things, of getting things done, are informal. You cannot go to some database and figure out what the truth is. You can't say, what's the plan here? There isn't a plan. You know, what you have to do is to figure out how the planning is happening informally. Merrick, you're going to say something.
I was just going to mention about jeepneys, which are in Manila, and that was the first time I went. We got to ride some jeepneys around together as a group, and we were wondering, what's the transport network like for a jeepney? If I'm not mistaken, there is no map, or there might have been a crowdsourced map, but it was only a partial map, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
But a lot of people just learn these networks over time. And so it's another way of knowing the city.
Yeah.
That is very different to how here in Melbourne, you learn about transport
So you
networks.
have very detailed transport.
Yes.
Here, there, you have to learn from the local knowledge. You have to ask around.
And I didn't look at transport in my personal work at all, but that's just another tiny learning that I had that I take with me everywhere I go.
All cities are a mix of formal and informal, you know, and they mesh together. It's not as if urban informality is separate and somewhere else. Everywhere, all architecture is a mix of formal and informal. You know, there is a formal arrangement of tables in this room, which we're talking about whether to rearrange them because it separates people a bit. It's very formal. And yet when we come into the room, we each choose our own spot in a fairly informal way. It happens all the time. Walking is informal transport. Public transport is, in this country, mostly formal, nearly all formal. Okay.
So the philosophy behind it is more like we are trying to use more formal knowledge and to kind of study the informality. And then sort of like I feel like informal informality and formal can be in the same level.
Is that a question? I think it's a question for you.
Yeah, I guess.
But I'm not sure. There aren't going to be easy answers to any of this stuff, but we are probably going to try and teach you to think through those interrelations between formal and informal, and and definitely to break from the idea that what you need is simply to impose a formal system on this, right? You can see if you went into the street and said, look, all of these people walking wherever they want. I mean, it's so messy. We have to have a bit more formality here. So we'll build some rails down the middle of the sidewalk and make everybody walk on the left. It would be a disaster because self-organization very often works really quite well. Do you have any questions, Finn, if you're still there?
Yeah, I've been checking. Let me look at the chat. Yeah. No questions written down.
Yep. Go on.
Yeah. I like to ask again, and for I don't get lost on the schedule. So there's a gap between the trip and the post trip trip. So it's like 14 June and 17 July. So what do we do between those days?
What do we do? I didn't quite understand.
Is
Your
there-
time, that's your time, basically.
Yeah, it's all your time. That's winter break. So
Yeah.
you can go traveling.
So if you want to stay longer
Yeah.
in the Philippines, or you want to probably visit your home country because it's closer to Manila.
It's a big world out there. You always learn more traveling than you do sitting still, right?
Like
Always.
in 2020, I think 4 or 5 students stayed longer. They went to some, the more beautiful parts of the Philippines. They went to some excellent beaches outside Metro Manila, stayed there for a week, then went back to Melbourne.
Yeah. Speak loudly because I'm hard of hearing.
More learning about other stuff that's not like physical architecture or design. So I'm wondering like where does our skill set as design students come into like when we're researching this like what kind of projects or learning do that is like
I think I understand. Yeah, so I think there's the question of, you know, how much are we going to be learning about sort of social political processes in the city
Yeah.
versus questions of design and architecture and in the skill sets of the map representation. How does that intersect with the bigger social questions and in that process of is that it? Yeah, okay.
And you're going to answer it, Chris.
Well, last year I was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I just kind of hung out, but I think it's both, right? I think you're going to be embedded within a different sort of cultural experience, and that will help inform the design and outputs that you create. So they're intertwined, they're interconnected. Some students might take on those bigger social questions, like there was a community planning, citizen planning group.
You'll learn skills that really cross over between disciplines, right? I think most of the time in most subjects here, you'll be learning specific disciplinary skills. Okay, now let's talk about diagnostic mapping, which Redden said proved to be particularly useful last time. What is diagnostic mapping? Is it a form of planning? Well, not really. It's certainly not architecture, but it's necessary in order to take the next step into architecture, because the diagnostic mapping was a means of saying this settlement has some good durable buildings, and this settlement has some very makeshift buildings that need to be demolished and replaced. But they're all mixed in with each other. You know, it's not as if you can say, we demolish that bit and keep this bit. They were all mixed in. So the diagnosis was really necessary in order to figure out what the design approach would be. And so then you start to look, and then Merrick's project in the end was one of going through and taking out particular buildings and replacing them with an architectural approach that said that the resources here are not sufficient to build like a 3 or 4 story building in one go, that they need to build it one room at a time, because that's the way the resources emerge. And so this is incremental architecture, architects learning how to deal with incremental architecture, which is added to over a period of time, is a skill that most architects simply don't have.
Who's that fantastic? I think it's a Chilean architect who would design and build half of a person's house.
Yeah, there's a huge demand for this kind of architectural. In fact, the Pritzker Prize, the big prize in architecture, has been won twice by architects who are really good at this stuff. Often because they're also good at making the buildings look very beautiful as well. That's what happens. There's no single skill set. The subject outline, have a look. I'm getting Merrick to collect the, if you got, okay, we've got all the emails. We'll have an email, and then I'll send you the subject number is actually there at the beginning. I'll go back to it. And you can plug that in, and you can see what all of the skill sets and the learning objectives of the subject are. There it is, 90440. So that will be the subject number. And as I say, it may not be online yet, but try it.
Check it.
It is active. Okay, so it's active. And there's quite a lot of sort of learning objectives and so on that are there. But those lists are a little bit bureaucratic. They tend to be, we'll be looking at skill sets that don't exist elsewhere in this faculty, at least, I don't think. And we're hoping that you will cross over the disciplines and learn a little bit about what the other disciplines are doing as well. But we expect, I mean, in as much as, if whatever your home discipline is, we're going to expect you to reach those professional standards in that discipline. You know, we expect the planners to understand the politics and indeed the statutory requirements of how planning works, just as we expect the architects to understand built form. More questions? Yeah.
Just curious, because like we said, that in settlements is on the land of the university. So, and it's informal, and then in one of the picture, you're saying that the university is telling them that's not their place to be.
Yeah.
So, like, I see a conflict over here. So
Yeah.
if we work on this project, in future, will there be like enforcement that it will be moved away or like?
I don't know how good you are at predicting the future, but I'm not really good at it. That tension has been there for a long time, and that is one of the things that we're not sure how that will be resolved. What we're saying though is that we have talked to the highest, the boss of the university campus, and indeed the deputy vice chancellors who are responsible for community affairs, who erect those signs, and they don't have a plan for what happens to these settlements. And it's unclear what will happen, but they're not going anywhere. I mean, it's not as if you just tell the people to go and they go. They don't. They resist. They've been there a long time. And indeed, we'll show you some settlements. Ones that we won't be looking at are the ones that have been there so long that the university doesn't even consider them contentious anymore. They're 4 stories high. They're the apartment buildings and so on. They're durable apartment buildings. They're mixed-use developments where academics and students live. This is not some kind of, it's the more precarious settlements that we'll actually be looking at and trying to find a future that resembles. So we'll be able to show you informal settlements that have worked, that have been developed and upgraded. So they're now quite effective places to live. Sometimes still a bit problematic because they're built on old tracks and trails with makeshift sewer lines and things like that. They need to be fixed up over time, and they have been. That's how this works, is that there's a process of continuous upgrading going on all the time.
I think it's an important question because it touches on the very important question of land tenure security. And that's actually part of the people's planning process. Some community leaders are trying to identify particular locations that would be acceptable to the university authority. So when you get there, you can ask the community leaders why they've chosen some sites over other areas. So
the planners among you will have to engage with, in fact, we'll all have to engage, but this is a particularly planning problem, of figuring out what a sensible strategy might be. Some of those settlements are in locations which are not sustainable long-term, right? Various reasons, including flooding. And there are other locations on campus that would be a much better site. And if we come up with visions for how that's possible, maybe we can convince the powers that be, the chancellor and so on, that this is the way in which they should go, because they're not going to remove those settlements. At the moment, they've been moving them around, that when they want a site, they find another site and they say, well, you still can't stay permanently, but you can build your house over there if you want for now. And then when they want that site, they move them onto somewhere else. They have 500 hectares. They do not need the land, right? And yet we still have the chancellor telling us it's university land and we're not allowed to re-gazette it for housing. But that's where we are. I know people are drifting off and we've got to finish.